welcome everyone. Welcome back. ATSV Phase 2, 2020. I would like to introduce our next speaker, but before I do that, I'd like to remind everybody that we do have a chat and Q&A function here. Everybody who's on the Zoom platform, please make sure to post your questions as they come up during the presentation, and we will address those at the end during Q&A. And that also goes for our Facebook viewers as well, our Facebook Live viewers. Please make sure to post your questions in Facebook, and they will be forwarded to me, and we will address those at the very end. So I'd like to introduce Nate Herman. He is a Senior Vice President of Policy at the American Apparel and Footwear Association. The title of his presentation today is "How Did the Election Impact the Industry?" A very pertinent topic right now, and I'm sure a lot of people are very curious to hear what Nate has to say. So Nate, welcome.
Thank you. And I'll just bring up my presentation. Thanks, Jason, and thanks to ATSV for having me participate in this great event. So, as Jason said, I'm here to talk about how the election impacted the industry. So I'm going to just jump right into it. First of all, if you don't know the American Apparel and Footwear Association, we are the National Association of the Apparel and Footwear Industry. We represent about 1,000 named brands, represent brands, retailers, manufacturers, and suppliers to the industry. And I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy at AFA, so that means I'm essentially the chief lobbyist for the association and the industry. So with that, let's just jump right into it. What I'm going to talk about today is the actual results of the election as we know it today, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And then we'll get into what that means overall, and then what that means for the industry on specific issues. And we'll go through a list of issues in the immediate sense, what's going to happen in the next few weeks to a few months, and what's going to happen next year or could happen next year. So again, let's get started here. So these are the presidential results. These are the results that have been projected by every major media outlet, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But you can see the results, and if the results remain this way, and the Electoral College, when they vote, agrees with this, and the Congress approves it at the beginning of next year, these will likely be the final results, which has President-elect Biden winning the election over President Trump by Electoral College count of 306 to 232. So the map I used here is 270 to win, but you could have pulled this map from Fox News, Real Clear Politics, New York Times, any number of sources, and would have essentially the same map. I did want to note that this number is a flip of the Electoral College vote in 2016, if these numbers remain the same, which had President Trump winning by 306 votes over Hillary Clinton, who got 232 votes. So what I mean about projections here. So first of all, let's talk about the popular vote. So this is as of just about half an hour ago. It shows Vice President Biden with a vote count of almost 79 million votes, or about 51% of the total vote, and President Trump with about 73 million votes, or about 47.3% of the vote. So about a 4-point margin in the popular vote. So a couple things I want to note about that. First, this is by far the most number of votes that have ever been cast in a presidential election. Both Vice President Biden and President Trump beat the previous record, which was the 2008 election of Barack Obama. You can see the numbers on the screen. So it's not even close. You're talking about almost over 9 million for Biden and over almost 4 million for Trump. And so the two candidates in this race have gotten the two most amount of votes ever recorded in a presidential election in the United States. So, but a lot of people have noted that there are some questions over the election. So there are court cases in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Having said that, many states have already certified their results, and others will be doing over the next few weeks. And so since we're talking about these 5 swing states that everybody's watching. These will win. Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin will be certifying their results. So that is the next step in the process. You have the initial results, which are reflected in the Electoral College map that I showed on the previous slide, which leads to projections. And then you have each state certify their results. And again, that process is going on now. Many states have already certified. Many will over the next couple weeks. Then the Electoral College votes on December 14th. They actually record the votes. And then that is not even the final step. The final step is that Congress validates the Electoral College vote when the new Congress is seated. And so they're seated on January 3rd, and 3 days after they're seated, which would be January 6th, they validate the Electoral College vote. And that's when it's official, 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 official. So that's when we will know with absolute certainty, hopefully, that who the next president will be. Now, there are issues that if one member of the Senate, one member of the House says that the Electoral College vote is inaccurate, that can lead to a vote in Congress to determine if they need to do something different. But there's only been one time where a House member and a senator disputed it, and their record of dissent was overwhelmingly rejected by both the House and Senate, and that was back in 2004. So this is really, if you want to see where this officially ends, this is the timeline for when it officially ends. So, but as of today, based on the results that we know, it looks like Vice President Biden is the president-elect and will be inaugurated on January 20th, 2021. So the other two things that we need to look at in terms of how does it impact the industry is we need to see who is going to control the House of Representatives and who's going to control the Senate. So where do we stand right now? Even as of today, we're talking about many days, 13 days after the election, we still don't know the final winner in 10 House races. There are 435 seats in the House, and we still don't know 10 of those House races. So what do we know so far? We know that the Republicans actually picked up a number of seats. There's a lot of talk about a blue wave. It did not materialize in the congressional races. And so in the House, what we saw is actually Republicans pick up 8 seats. Many of the 10 undecided seats, there's a belief that Republicans will pick up the majority of those seats. So you could see at the end of this end of this year, you could see, and in the beginning of next year, you can see a new Congress, the 117th Congress, with Democrats having a much smaller majority in the House. We're talking about possibly 222 to 213, so fewer than 10 votes. And for comparison, if you look at the current House, the House that is in session today, you're talking about a 35 vote difference. So a really big majority to a much, much smaller majority in the next House, in the next Congress. So the Senate is also interesting. Again, there was this expectation that there would be a blue wave and that if Biden won the presidential election, that the Senate would then flip over Democrats. Instead, what you have is that as of today, the Democrats have only picked up a net of 1 seat so far. They won both Arizona Senate races, while the Republicans picked up the Alabama Senate seat. And so a net of 1. And there are 2 outstanding races. Neither of the Senate races in Georgia was decided. In Georgia, you're required to have 50% plus 1 of the vote. Otherwise, you're forced to go to a runoff. And so neither of the Republican incumbents had the 50% plus 1. And so they were forced to go in a runoff against the chief Democratic nominee. And so those runoffs will happen on January 5th. So what happens? So the likely scenario is at least one of those seats remains Republican, which means Republicans maintain control of the Senate. It will be a much smaller majority, 51-49 majority, but they will still retain control of the Senate. And so that'll matter a lot when we talk about some of the issues that are coming up. If the Democrats do pick up both seats in Georgia, what that means is that you have a 50-50 tie. And the tiebreaker vote is the president of the Senate, who happens to be the vice president. So if Biden is confirmed as the winner of the presidential election, that means Senator Harris, who's soon to become Vice President Harris, will be the deciding vote. And that means the Democrats technically had the majority. This has happened once before. In that one situation, there was an attempt to have a power sharing arrangement where you had sort of dual chairs of the committees. You had essentially 50-50 splits on the committees. That was a different time. I don't know if that would happen here, but that is something to be watching very closely. And those two elections on January 5th are going to get a lot of attention. So again, overall thoughts, huge turnout, but that turnout was for both, the additional turnout was for both candidates. That turnout led to even more divided Congress than we had previously, with much smaller majorities for the Democrats in the House and likely a much smaller majority for the Republicans in the Senate. So you have a divided government. And so that'll have implications going forward. That could be positive, which means people work together to get things done, or it could be negative, and that people will try and prevent anybody else from getting things done until the next election. So, and then what that also means is we have an uncertain lame duck session. So even though many members of Congress were voted out and some had retired, they are still coming back to finish off the business that was not done before the election. And so the Senate came back last week and the House comes back this week. And so we're gonna talk about what that means. So what's next? Have the magic 8 ball. We have, we're doing a lot of guessing here, but it's a really dynamic time. We haven't been in this situation in a long time. There was no clear mandate from the election one way or the other. And so that's what we're facing right now. So again, this lame duck session is when Congress, the old Congress, comes back after the election, but before the end of the year, to finish up all the business that they didn't get to before the election. So what are the absolute must-pass things to do before this lame duck Congress adjourns for the holidays? The first is funding the government. The government right now is only funded through middle of December. So if you want the government to shut down again, Congress could leave now and not deal with that. Otherwise, they need to pass either the government's full appropriations for 2021 or pass another short-term continuing resolution to fund the government until the new Congress is seated and can deal with the issues. So that's an absolute must. The second, which most people believe is an absolute must before the lame duck session ends, is the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. This legislation is passed by Congress every year to basically tell the military what it needs to be doing and what are the priorities for the US military. This is not an absolute have to pass, but it has always been passed every year for decades. And so most people at this point consider it a must pass piece of legislation. The House and Senate have both passed their own versions of the NDAA, but they haven't reached a compromise package yet. Now we get to the things that don't necessarily have to happen, but from our industry's perspective, many of them we want to happen, some of them we don't want to happen. So the first is a stimulus package. Obviously, there was a lot of discussion before the election about the need for new stimulus. We've seen in the last 2 weeks the amount of COVID cases, the amount of hospitalizations, the amount of deaths increase dramatically. This is the time our industry and our economy really needs help. And so there is a big push right now to get the Republicans and Democrats to agree on a stimulus package during the lame duck session. Otherwise, that means we're waiting until February before Congress acts. And that's just too long for our industry and for the economy as we're going into what could be a very long winter to not have any support or stimulus. So both sides are saying the right things. Both sides say they want a deal, but the same problems that prevented a deal before the election still exist. Both sides are very far apart on the size of the package, with the Republicans talking about in the hundreds of billions, and the Democrats are talking about over $2 trillion. And so there's a lot of disagreements on the size of the package and what's included in the package. And so we'll have to see where that goes. Then there's the confirmation of US Circuit and District Court nominees. If it is indeed going to be a President Biden come January 20th, there is a strong impetus for Senator McConnell to keep the Senate in session for as long as possible and approve as many of President Trump's nominees to the US Circuit and US District Courts as possible before the end of the year. And so that's something to watch, both obviously because it impacts the courts, but also because that could determine the length of the lame duck session, which then is either good or bad for the next few items I'm going to talk about. The next item is the Generalized System of Preferences Program, or GSP. This is a program that provides duty-free access for US imports of travel goods and many other items to the US market. It does not affect apparel and footwear at this time, although there are efforts to try and expand that next year. We'll talk about that in the next slide. It currently expires on December 31st, and unless Congress renews it. And so we're down to the lame duck session to get Congress to renew it. Similarly, we had the miscellaneous tariff bill. The current miscellaneous tariff bill expires December 31st. There is a new miscellaneous tariff bill process. Many of you participated in that process. There are hundreds of provisions that affect apparel and footwear and travel goods that could provide temporary duty-free access for US imports of specific products from any country. And so there's a lot of interest in the MTB. Again, Congress needs to approve it before the lame duck session adjourns. The next one is not necessarily a Congress issue, but it could be. And this is the current China 301 tariffs, the current punitive tariffs against apparel, footwear, and travel goods coming from China. There are a number of exclusions we got, and this is particularly important for personal protective equipment like face masks. We've gotten a number of exclusions, but they all currently expire on December 31st. So essentially what that could mean with all three of these, the GSP, MTB, and the China tariff exclusions, is that on January 1st, our industry could experience a huge tax increase, essentially, in the form of tariffs. And so we're working hard to try and prevent all that. And these are things that we want Congress to deal with, and obviously President Trump to deal with in the next few weeks. And the final issue I want to mention is the China Uyghur issue. And some of you might have heard about this, but this is an issue. This is legislation called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that passed the House this fall by a vote of 406-3. So very strong bipartisan legislation that is sitting now in the Senate. And what it would do is over allegations that the Chinese government is oppressing ethnic Muslim Uyghurs in the far western province of Xinjiang and detaining them and putting them in forced labor situations. The legislation would ban all imports from China or from any imports that contain any nexus with Xinjiang. So for example, in our industry, Xinjiang produces 85% of the cotton that is produced in China. It also produces a lot of the yarns and fabrics. So that means it could be any item that contains any cotton coming out of China or possibly out of many other countries could be banned under this legislation. And there is an effort, a strong effort to try and get this legislation passed during the lame duck session in Congress. And so we are working very hard on that issue as well. And so those are the issues that we're talking about on lame duck. Currently, the lame duck is scheduled to end December 11th for the House and December 18th for the Senate. So right before the holidays. But if you think about it, we have Thanksgiving week and Congress won't be in session Thanksgiving week. So we're talking about the House, according to the current schedule, only has 3 weeks of being in session to deal with all these issues, plus probably dozens more that have nothing to do with our industry. And the Senate will only have 4 weeks to deal with all these issues. And that's if they even stay in that long. And that's a big question right now. They might, again, just pass the continuing resolution and NDAA and call it a day. And so we're watching that very closely. So what does the election mean for after this year, 2021 and beyond? So the first 2 issues on this list also could be issues before the end of this year, but I wanted to put them originally in next year, and I can talk about why they could be this year issues as well. First, as all of you know, we've been dealing with the trade war with China for the last 3+ years, which has cost the American economy over $550 billion in punitive tariffs. And so it's really had a huge impact. All of you know that, and for the foreseeable future will continue to do so. So the question is, what if Vice President Biden is the president-elect, what would a President Biden do with the China trade war? And so a lot of questions been said about this, but there are some people who believe that a President Biden would lift the punitive tariffs on China fairly quickly. We believe, however, that this, if it happens at all, it will take a while, because a President Biden has other issues with China, human rights issues. I just described one of them, but issues with Hong Kong as well, other issues on climate change, and the Paris Climate Accords, and many other issues, territorial rights, China's aggression in the South China Sea. There are many other issues that will be involved in any decision that a President Biden would make. And so we don't see quick action on the tariffs in a Biden administration, but we're not precluding any action to reverse or reduce the current punitive tariffs on China in a Biden administration. The second item is an item that has been started under the Trump administration. And so we put it on here because what would happen under a Biden administration with the investigation. So President Trump launched an investigation, a Section 301 investigation, the same investigation that led to the tariffs on China, on Vietnam, for allegations that it's undervaluing its currency, excuse me, and that it's dumping timber on the US market. So the comment period on this investigation closed last Thursday, the 12th. So under the timelines of the China tariffs, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4, President Trump could take action fairly quickly to impose tariffs. Well, let's say he doesn't. There were literally thousands of comments submitted. If they actually took time to read all those, that would take time. And so what if President Trump doesn't take action? What would a President Biden do with this investigation? In our opinion, President Biden would probably do nothing with the investigation. He would not take any action under the investigation, and he might just formally end it. I think in President Biden's mind, Vietnam has done many of the right things. The US business community has gone to Vietnam because the Trump administration told the US business community to get out of China. And so there are a number of reasons that we believe that President Biden would not pursue Section 301 tariffs against Vietnam. In fact, over time, could even talk about some sort of free trade agreement with Vietnam or resurrecting the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, what is now called the CPTPP. And so that might be it would basically, President Biden would take trade policy towards Vietnam in a much different direction. But again, in both those, President Trump, in his remaining 2 months in office, assuming that he did indeed lose the election, could do a lot of things now on China and on Vietnam. On Vietnam, he could literally impose Section 301 tariffs any day now. And so those are things to keep in mind both now and going into 2021. So the other issues that will come up in 2021, Trade Promotion Authority. This is the authority that the president uses to negotiate free trade agreements with other countries. And it's authority given by Congress so that Congress doesn't nitpick any final agreement. Basically, Congress can vote up or down on the agreement without any changes once the president negotiates and signs an agreement. And so that authority expires in the middle of next year. If that authority expires, it'll be much harder for President Biden, for example, to negotiate trade agreements. And so we have 2 trade agreements that President Trump has already started negotiating, one with the United Kingdom and one with Kenya. And it would call those agreements, those negotiations into question if there's no effort to renew Trade Promotion Authority. But it's unclear if a new Trade Promotion Authority would be approved by Congress. As I mentioned previously, Congress is going to be extremely divided. The Democrats have a much slimmer majority. Even if they do win both Georgia House seats, they'll have the thinnest of thinnest majorities, and it'll be very difficult for things to happen. And even if the Democrats are in control, there'll be a lot of demands for changes. If there's a divided Congress, both sides will be demanding changes to TPA, which all taken together might kill any attempt to renew Trade Promotion Authority. And so we'll have to see where that takes trade agreements. Now, again, currently the UK and Kenya are the only 2 trade agreements being negotiated. What would President Biden do? President-elect Biden, or Vice President Biden, has made clear that he will focus on domestic investments, mostly in his first year. So it is unlikely, even if there is new Trade Promotion Authority, it's unlikely that we would see President Biden initiate new trade agreements in his first 6 months, and possibly as much as his first year, until he's fulfilled that commitment to make investments in the domestic economy. The Shop Safe Act and the Inform Act, these are big issues in our industry in terms of counterfeiting. What we have already had a major issue with third-party platforms like the Amazons of the world, and now social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram, with counterfeit products being sold. The pandemic has made that situation 1,000 times worse, because just as everybody started buying a lot more online, so have counterfeiters have been selling a lot more online. And many of these products are not only lost business for all of you, but also could be potentially dangerous products for our customers. And so there's been a big effort to try and create liability and transparency when it comes to sellers on third-party platforms. And so these 2 pieces of legislation, while there'll be no action this year, will be reintroduced next year, and we would be working hard towards passage of both. One would create a liability for third-party platforms for the products sold on their platforms, and the other would require the third-party platform provide a lot more information about the seller of an individual product. Contact information, including address and phone number and email address, information about the background of the seller, how long they've been on the platform, what are their ratings, so on and so forth. So next thing I want to mention is reform of GSP. As I mentioned previously, there are some efforts to get apparel and footwear added to GSP, but there are also efforts by others, including many Democrats, to tighten the requirements for countries to be eligible for the GSP program. GSP is targeted towards developing countries, not including China, not including Vietnam. And right now, GSP only has 3 requirements that countries are supposed to be striving towards the promotion of international labor rights, striving towards intellectual property protection, preventing counterfeits, and striving towards opening their markets to US products and services. There's a lot of talk about adding an environmental element, human rights element, strengthening the labor rights provisions. There are also talks about restricting the types of products that could be included in GSP. And so if GSP is renewed before the end of this year, the reform of GSP, whatever that means, will be a topic of hot debate next year. There is the WTO. There's been a lot of talk about reform of the WTO during the Trump administration, and what has essentially brought the WTO to a crawl in terms of its activity. And so is this going to be a major priority in a Biden administration? We believe it will be, but we'll have to see where those negotiations go towards fixing some of the problems raised by the Trump administration. And then finally, I do want to raise the issue of labor and human rights. I mentioned the Uyghur issue on my previous slide. I do want people to be aware that if we do indeed have a Biden administration after January 20th, there will be a renewed focus on labor and human rights, and that could have a direct impact on the industry. As I mentioned, under GSP, labor rights is a key provision. And there's been many issues raised with a number of countries that are GSP countries that are major suppliers of travel goods to our industry and to our country that could be reviewed under a Biden administration. Those include Cambodia, and Indonesia, Burma, India. India is not currently in GSP, but is trying to get back into GSP. That could affect Bangladesh trying to get back into GSP. There's also human rights issues. Again, Cambodia, who's banned their opposition party. You could even be looking at Burma, again, over the Rohingya and the ethnic, some people have said ethnic genocide, ethnic cleansing. You could look at Philippines, what's happened with President Duterte in the Philippines. You could even be looking at issues in Ethiopia with the Ethiopian government's invasion of the province of Tigray that has happened over the last week. So those issues could play in and could lead to sanctions, which then can impact our ability to source from those countries. And so I do want people to be thinking about that if it is a Biden administration after January 20th. So the last thing I wanted to talk about before we got to questions is the issue of congressional committees and government agencies. These are just a small list of the agencies and congressional committees that impact the apparel and footwear industry. Decisions made by them have a direct impact on our industry. And the people that lead those committees and who are on these committees or head these agencies can have a huge influence on how these agencies or committees impact our industry. So I just want to give you a couple examples. First, the Senate Finance Committee. We know if the Republicans retain control, that Senator Chuck Grassley will no longer be chair of the Senate Finance Committee. It'll go to Senator Mike Crapo, who's been a longtime member of the Finance Committee, but is basically an unknown entity on trade issues. He'll be chairing the key committee that deals with trade issues in the Senate, and yet we don't know how he feels about apparel and footwear when it comes to trade at all. He's from a state that doesn't have many apparel and footwear businesses. And so it's sort of an unknown entity as we go into the next Congress. Further, in the House Ways and Means Committee, the Trade Subcommittee is chaired by Congressman Earl Blumenauer from Portland, Oregon. Has always been a strong supporter of our industry, which is great and should be a good thing going into the next Congress. But there's talk about Congressman Blumenauer being nominated to be Secretary of Transportation in a Biden administration, which means all of a sudden this reliable partner would no longer be in that position, and we don't know who would get that position instead. Turning to the government agency side, look at the Office of U.S. Trade Representative. This is the key agency on trade in the U.S. government. Obviously, U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer has had a major impact on the industry in the last few years, particularly as it relates to China, but in other areas as well. What would a new USTR mean for the agency? If you look at the landing team that a President-elect Biden has put together for the U.S. Trade Representative, that could raise some concerns. There's a number of labor people on the committee, a number of protectionists on the landing team. Could that mean that we could have a much more protectionist USTR? Or would it be somebody like Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who's been mentioned for the position, who would take probably a much more pragmatic view of trade? And you're looking at other agencies like the US Department of Labor. There's been talk about Bernie Sanders being put in. What would that mean for the International Labor Affairs Division at the Department of Labor? The same thing with the Department of Treasury. There's talk about Senator Elizabeth Warren being nominated to be Treasury Secretary. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is the main sanctions making body in the US government, is under the US Department of Treasury. What would that mean for our industry? And other key agencies like US Customs and Border Protection do matter a lot for our industry. So I'll stop there and leave enough time for questions. So I'll turn it back to you, Jason.
All right, thank you, Nate. It's very nice to have it kind of detailed and laid out like that. It's like there's so much conflicting and non-up-to-date information on the website, on the internet. So thank you very much for that breakdown and how it affects the apparel industry. Okay, we have a question here. The pandemic is out of control in the USA because of Trump. Do you think there will be textiles developed specifically to kill the virus in the air for indoor usage?
There has been a lot of talk, and it's not my area of expertise, but there has been talk about creating fabrics that are somehow resistant to the coronavirus, to COVID-19. But I'll leave that to others to answer that question more. Yeah,
that's probably more of a textile science question rather than policy. Okay, next we have, I do know that there's some fabrics that are antimicrobial that like zinc oxides woven into the fabric. I'm not quite sure where to source that material, but don't know how effective they would be against the virus. All right, next. If the Republicans keep the Senate, what would you expect to happen with the Uruguay legislation? Oh, sorry.
This is the Uyghur.
Not Uruguay.
No, Uyghur.
For me.
Uyghur.
Yeah, there we go. Both bills, thank you.
So yeah, that's been a big question. So if somehow the Senate doesn't vote on the legislation before the end of the lame duck session and the Republicans retain control of the Senate, what would happen next year? Our view is that there's a lot of momentum behind the Uyghur legislation, particularly the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is HR 6210. And so we think that even if Congress doesn't deal with it before the end of this year, that it will come right back and move to the top of the agenda early next year. And so could be voted on and approved by early spring in one form or another. That's why we're working with a number of other associations and industries to try and get changes to the bill. But our belief is that there's bipartisan momentum behind this legislation. And so something is going to pass. And so what we're trying to do is make it more workable for the industry. It's not a question of if, it's more of a question of when.
Okay. Let me see if there's any questions from our Facebook live audience. Doesn't look like it. Nate, will you be popping into the, excuse me, one more question to follow that up from Laura Rabinowitz. Hello, Laura. Excited to see your presentation tomorrow. What about the second bill for public companies?
The bill that Laura is referring to is the Uyghur Forced Labor Disclosure Act, which is HR 6270. It also passed the House, but a much more party line vote, and has not been addressed by the Senate yet. This would create a public disclosure requirement for companies that they would have to report quarterly what their nexus is with Xinjiang to the Securities and Exchange Commission. That legislation, I'm not sure has as much momentum, especially since a large part of it's already incorporated in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And so I think what we'll see most likely is one bill pass, some sort of combination of the two bills pass. If it doesn't happen this winter with HR 6210, if it doesn't happen in the next month, then I would see it, the bill is being combined in the next Congress into a single bill.
Okay, what would you say is the, Nate, what would you say is the, I got two questions for you here. One, what would you say is the biggest concern, based on everything you just spoke about, whether it's the government going on shutdown, again, whether it's, you know, some of these, this legislation that you had mentioned before, moving forward here for the apparel industry, what would you think is the biggest concern? And the second question, follow-up question to that, which I'll ask in a second, is the flip side of that.
So I'm not sure I could pick a single question or single concern. So I would say the three biggest concerns that people would have to look at over the next few months is whether Congress approves the stimulus package, again, especially if we start going into another shutdown of the economy. A stimulus package is going to be critical to help the industry survive and get to the other side of this pandemic. And so that's extremely important. And then what happens on China and Vietnam? What happens? Will President Trump do something before he leaves office? If he leaves office on January 20th, what will a Biden administration do after January 20th? I think those are the biggest issues for the industry right now. In terms of the least important issues,
or the most optimistic side of what you think might help us economically, or as far as the industry goes, what you think the biggest.
If there is a Biden administration, I believe that there will eventually be discussion about doing some sort of Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP trade agreement with countries in Asia to be as a bulwark against China. So I think that either talk about rejoining TPP or doing some sort of other comprehensive trade agreement could come up in discussions in year two of a Biden administration. So we could see, as opposed to just new tariffs, we could see things like reducing tariffs, and that could also be a positive. I could see that a President Biden looking at GSP as a program that has a lot of benefits, and so it would be worthwhile offering apparel and footwear to developing countries as an incentive for them to address the requirements in a GSP program. And so I can see him using both of those as almost a foreign policy tool as a bulwark against a rising China.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again, Nate. That was very detailed. And again, thank you for laying it out in a way that was very easy to understand. So I would like to recommend to everybody, Nate, will you be visiting the virtual room after this? Yep. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
There you go. Okay, great. So I just included the link here in the chat function to everyone, and I would like to remind everybody, and please encourage them to visit the dashboard, which is what this is linked to for the trade show. And then if you scroll down one scroll, you'll see our matchmaking virtual hangout, and that's essentially taking place at the show floor. So that's a great place to network, great place to engage with our speakers, ask them any other questions you might have, and also to ask the ATS staff any questions you might have. And also please use that as a resource for matchmaking. Also included on the dashboard is the exhibitor halls for our different pavilions. So please check those out and to address your sourcing needs. So Nate, thank you again for your contributions here, and you take care.
Thank you for the opportunity.